On my left here, Dr. Mohamed Effendy is a lecturer at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He holds a PhD in history specializing in Southeast Asian studies. He earned his doctorate from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where his research focused on the history of the Cham community from the 17th to 19th centuries. Dr. Effendy is a dedicated historian with a diverse range of research interests and expertise in pre-colonial and colonial Southeast Asian history. His research also extends to martial arts studies, a field that combines historical research with martial art tradition and practices in Southeast Asia. In the middle here, we have Professor Chong Guan. Professor Kwa is an adjunct associate professor at the History Department, National University of Singapore, and he's also a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And he's also an associate fellow at the archaeological unit of the ICES Institute. Kwa's expertise lies in exploring extended historical cycles and emerging deep histories of Southeast Asia. He started his career working on policy analysis at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then the Ministry of Defense before being assigned to reorganize the Oral History Department at the National Archives. In addition, he previously held the head of the old Department of Strategic Studies at Safti Military Institute, where he taught military history and strategic studies. Today, he continues to examine the implicit narratives underpinning the framing of regional security issues. And last but not least, Professor Wang Gungwu. He is an internationally renowned historian, famed for his scholarship on the history of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, as well as the history and civilization of China and Southeast Asia. He was a history professor at the University of Malaya, the Australian National University, and the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Wang is Professor Emeritus at the Australian National University and University Professor of the National University of Singapore, the highest academic title conferred by NUS. He was the founding chairman of NUS's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, director and chairman of Singapore's East Asian Institute, chairman of ICES, and his international awards include Commander of the British Empire, given out by the British government, the Tang Prize in Sinology in 2020, and the Singapore government's Distinguished Service Order in 2020. He earned his BA and MA in history from NUS when it was previously the University of Malaya, and he holds a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Dr. Effendy, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Right. Thank you, Matthew, for that amazing lecture just now. I was taking notes. It's pretty good. Some of the stuff they didn't even teach at university. Excellent. First of all, I would like to begin with a thank you to Professor Chong Guan, Wang Gungwu, and yourself for adding me to the contributors of the book, because I wasn't initially part of the original lineup, right, of singers. So after that invitation by you, which I humbly accepted, I was very much amazed at what has been done, because once you read the draft in its totality, it really does point out to potential amazing ramifications to a new understanding of Singapore's history. So I think this is an amazing book to have for my classes when I force my students to read it, yeah, for their essays, so on and so forth. My chapter is specifically focused on Sultan Ali, the son of Sultan Hussein, all right, the guy who signed the Treaty of Raffles along with Temenggong Abdul Rahman. Now, initially, my interest in this particular Sultan, I didn't take him very seriously initially until 2018, for which I engaged in this National Heritage Board project to compile oral histories from as many Malay martial arts groups in Singapore as I can. Now, among all these groups, which amount to 30+ groups, several of them have distinct memory handed down orally by their grandfathers and great-grandfathers about this mysterious guy called Sultan Ali, who had deployed Bugis fighters in his battles against the Malay forces in Johor. Initially, when I heard about this, I didn't take it too seriously until I dove into the sources, what the British especially have written about this particular Sultan Ali of Johor. And lo and behold, I found a lot of messy information, meaning that a lot of what has been written about the British, about Sultan Ali, did not fit at all with our ongoing understanding of Singapore's history. It is a very problematic character to understand Singapore's history from, and it is very, very problematic to place him inside any narrative of Singapore's modern history, because Sultan Hussein, Sultan Ali, and his son, Tengku Alam, are all considered failures by the British imperial machine. So this is something which I find myself at a loss of what to do until you emailed me. You asked me whether I can contribute a chapter on Sultan Ali. I said yes. Why? Because I found a way to reintegrate him into Singapore's history. How? By examining his role in trying to develop this area called Muar Kesang. The British wrote horrendously about him, depicting him as a brutally violent ruler, incapable, indolent. I decided to reimagine him as a capable ruler with evidence, of course, and lo and behold, I uncovered resources that Sultan Ali had access to, which would have made him into a successful one. However, he was so embattled with problems, inherited problems from his father, such as that, and also one thing which he did not realize after the British put him in the Muar Kesang area, he didn't realize that this area had already been under a rule of a very powerful Temenggung of Johor called Temenggung Ismail, who decided to go to war with him. So this he had to handle, and which depleted further his resources. And what really was the nail in the coffin was that when Sultan Ali made the decision to hire Bugis mercenaries, that was the end of him. Why? They rebelled against him, and he had to basically, well, disappear, right? Meaning that, his powers are all in shambles. His Bugis allies left him, and even the British saw him as this useless guy who kept on being aggressive towards them, which further marginalized him. But his failure led to further entrenchment of British colonial power in Singapore. This failure gave the British the perfect excuse to exclude Tengku Alam from receiving that sultanate, basically, the sultan title, and they gave it to our friend in Johor. So this is something which I think is useful for the book. It causes us to reimagine not just Sultan Ali, but also Sultan Hussein and Tengku Alam, which is the future project that I have in the works, all right? So this is my contribution to, I think, to this amazing book that you have here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, Professor Kwa.
Yeah. Well, first, let me join Mohamed Effendy in congratulating you, Matthew. Clearly, your briefing just now showed that you are one of our youngest emerging historians here. I mean, like Effendy, I found much to learn as to how to talk about the historiography of Singapore, which I have also taught in the university. And I think you have done a very good lecture if you were there instead of me. Also, to congratulate you for the audacity, the gumption to first organize this conference in August 2023, and to successfully engage the biggest names in Singapore history, from our Shifu, Prof. Wang, Prof. Peter Boschbach. No. I am only the fixer. I bring things together here. So here, you have got the best in that conference, and you have added to it. I'm sorry, my young colleague, Benjamin Khoo, is not here. He has done a wonderful chapter in the book on what can we learn from the Dutch sources here. The Dutch sources, as Matthew has pointed out, has been systematically ignored by the founding professors of our university, as Prof. Wang can recall. For them, it was only the English sources that were reliable. As one of them told me about Raffles, when I quoted the Dutch sources that Syed Hussein attested. What do you expect from the Dutch except diatribes against Raffles? So that was the attitude there. So Peter Boschberg, who unfortunately is not here, would tell you he has had a difficult time convincing his colleagues that there are things in the non-English sources, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and now he's been finding out the Germans here. So there is a lot more. And I think at this point of time, Peter and I are concluding that we probably know a lot more sources, have a lot more sources. We know a lot more about that 500 years between the fall of Malacca and the arrival of Raffles than we know of the next 2 centuries of British colonial rule. So here we are really making great progress. The new edition of that 700-year book that Matthew has so kindly been showing all the covers of, we are being asked to update it, and we are now wondering, we've got so much new material to put in, how big a book will you all carry? 600 pages? 700? We can't make it that, but as Matthew would tell you as a book publisher, a 700-page book of Singapore history would probably not sell very well. So that's where we are. So here, I think Mohamed Effendy is onto something very interesting and new. Very few of us have heard of Sultan Ali. You know, we all know of Tunku Hussein, but Sultan Ali, no. And the British historians, Sir Richard Winstead among them, has given Sultan Ali a very bad name. Winstead wrote of him, you know, that he didn't appoint a successor when he should, and when he did, his successor was not his firstborn son of a royal wife, but the third son of a commoner wife. And he didn't even introduce that commoner son as his successor to the Malay nobles and royals. So there was a huge dispute, as Mohamed Effendy was telling us, at the death of Sultan Ali. And it went up to the Supreme Court. Who has got the rights to the rent of Kampong Glam? Kampong Glam was then all under the royal family, the Malay royals. They were collecting rent. Well, who gets the rent? It went to the High Court. The High Court said, looked at it, none of you, either of you, have got the rights to that land. You all never registered it with the land office in Singapore. You're all illegal tenants and squatters. And the colonial office took it over and managed it and decided how much of it to give back to the Malay royals. But that wasn't, of course, enough. And the Malay royals then became a terrible embarrassment to the colonial government compared to Abu Bakr in Johor and the others. They were impoverished. And so the colonial government said, we can't have this. We got to do something. And they actually concocted a bill. They passed a bill in the Legislative Council, a bill to provide for the descendants, family of Sultan Hussein in 1927. And that bill decreed that the colonial government will collect all the rent from Kampong Glam and then give it out back to the descendants of Sultan Ali. Male descendants only. And that continued right down till 1980-something. So in 1967 or so, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was asked in Parliament by Tang Si Chip, as the Minister of Finance, this item in this budget you are introducing, why is there this payment to the descendants of Sultan Ali. And Dr. goes, well, that's a debt we inherited from Raffles and we are carrying it through. And so we continue collecting rent and paying out much of it to the descendants of Sultan Hussein. And here, I think one of our departments actually had one full-time officer just checking who are the male descendants of Sultan Hussein that deserve to get a cut of this. And they found that people range from princes in Kelantan to people in Bintan. And they continued until 1987, because who's going to invest in Kampung Glam and the development when they couldn't get any returns, because it all went to the family of the male descendants of Sultan Hussein. So that was when Jayakumar, when he was the Minister of National Development, will acquire the land and pay off the sultans. So here you see the long-lasting legacy of Sultan Ali and what he did or he didn't do. But there's only one insight. I think the other essays here are very interesting in this book, and I would encourage you, if for no other reason, to buy it. Not for the two essays that Peter Boschberg and I wrote. That is merely a summary of what we've been doing. Peter Boschberg, what are the European sources, what are the problems interpreting them, and myself on the archaeological sources. I think the more interesting essays are by Wang, a young historian, on how was Malay history written. And it was one man, whom some of us know, Sir Richard of Winstead. We know from the research of Wang that Winstead single-handedly laid the foundations for a history of Malaya, which has today become the national history of Malaysia, that starts with the Malacca Sultanate, goes on to Johor, and Singapore, for Winstead, is part of that history of Malacca, carried to Johor. We were part of Johor, right? And the Strait Settlement after that, right down to 1947, when Winstead finally acknowledges, well, with Malaysia going independent, Singapore will have its own history. So Winstead was fundamental in the writing of our history, which I don't think, again, many of us realize. And my other colleague, Benjamin, who should have been here, again on this issue. We all know the 1824 treaty between the Dutch and the British. We know what the British wrote and thought. We know from the work of Peter Boschberg what the Dutch thought. That's a long story by itself, which we can go into if you're interested. But the poor Malay Sultan Hussein, his brother in Bintan, Abdul Rahman, what did they think? And so this young Dutch translator, Malay linguist translator, 27 years old, less than 30, he was dispatched from Batavia, Jakarta today, to go and explain to the court in Riau, sorry, we promised to protect and keep you all in power, but we couldn't, and here's the reasons why, which he did with some aplomb. They managed to convince the sultans, Abdul Rahman in Bintan, the best solution will be for you to gift Singapore to your half-brother, Sultan Hussein. And he persuaded the court in Riau to do that. And then he came to Singapore and he met John Crawford. So he wrote a very detailed report on what the sultans and the royal court thought of the treaty. And Benjamin has studied that, and from the scribblings in the margin, he has deciphered and been able to interpret what did that court in the Riaus and Sultan Hussein think of how their territories were being divided up. So if for no other reason, that's another reason for you to get hold of the book when it comes out there. So here we have in this book, fascinating new ways, new areas of looking at Singapore history. So let me stop here, and I hope I convince you that the book should be bought. You all should buy a copy when it comes out.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Last but not least.
I also joined Professor Kwok in congratulating Matthew for organizing all this. I mean, this has been over a couple of years now, and it's really amazing what you have been able to do. But as a result of being reminded of that, I have to say that the question just now about Japanese sources had reminded me that the Japanese had a different name for Singapore. So it struck me that what Matthew started out with when we all met a couple of years ago was reimagining Southeast Asian history. But what he has come out with after 2 years and so on is reimagining Singapore history. So what it struck me was what I should be talking about is not reimagining or any kind of imagining, but renaming. He's renamed Southeast Asian history to Singapore history. Then renaming, the question about Japan reminded me of, that's what we have done. We have renamed reimagining Southeast Asian history to reimagining Singapore history quite easily. You drop a few papers and add a few others, but very imaginative. You've actually created something very new because we've actually added new papers which reimagine Singapore, having been stimulated by the idea of reimagining Southeast Asia. So I want to come back to this now, just to show that reimagining and renaming are actually related. As I said, the Japanese example of renaming Singapore, there's a purpose to it. When you rename something, you have a reason for changing its name. And so Professor Kwok just reminded us that Winstead was responsible for this Malaya, which at the time included the Straits Settlements and all the Malay states, and it was British Malaya, and British Malaya included Singapore. And I belong to the generation which actually believed that the word Malaya always included Singapore. There was no separate place called Singapore when I grew up. There was just Malaya. And that was used by the British, but it was actually not invented by Winstead. It was used before that. People like Swettenham and people earlier had used the word Malaya, but exactly what they meant by it is not the same as what Winstead meant by it. So that even the name itself, having been given the name Malaya, the meaning of Malaya changed from Wilkinson to Swettenham to Winstead. And Winstead had a very deliberate plan to turn this word Malaya to mean the Malay states as the basis of it. And Singapore was just part of the fact was all these Malay states were controlled by Singapore. He didn't mention that. But what he recognized was this, so Malaya was the same as Tanah Melayu. And that was the word that he stressed in all the textbooks that he did for the Malay schools, which is very famous. And of course, I come from the state of Perak originally, so those textbooks were actually taught in the Sultan Idris Teachers Training College, which was in Dargansan, not on border of Selangor and Perak. And we always assumed that was Perak's school. But the main thing is that, again, in this new article on Winstead's contribution towards the creation of ultimately a new country based on the idea of Tanah Melayu was very crucial. By changing the name, that name didn't exist. It still did not exist officially. Officially it was British Malaya or Malaya, and then only in these Malay textbooks that were used in the Sultan Idris Training College and in primary school textbooks and so on was the use Tanah Melayu. But the interesting thing is that when the Federation of Malaya, after the Malayan Union failed, the British introduced the idea of a Malayan Union, which the Malays rejected, and the non-Malays didn't quite understand what it meant and didn't care. So they changed the name and they had the Federation of Malaya. And I do remember, because not being born in Malaya, I was born in Indonesia, as you know, so I had to become a Malayan by actually applying to be a federal citizen. So I was very conscious of the fact that when I applied, when I got my citizenship, I was a federal citizen of the Federation of Malaya. But what I discovered was everywhere else, especially in the Malay language, which I was studying at the time, it was never called the Federation of Malaya or Persekutuan Malaya. It was always called Persekutuan Tanah Melayu. Malaya was never used in any Malay documents that I've ever seen. So the Malay people actually rejected it totally and accepted the name that was given by Winstead, because that had been very popular and used in the schools from the 1920s onwards. For 20, 30 years, that had been drummed into the schoolboys that there's such a place as Tanah Melayu, but Malaya was never used in the Malay language. So it was very interesting that you actually create a country, you name it Federation of Malaya. The Constitution says, in English anyway, Federation of Malaya. It is registered in the United Nations as the Federation of Malaya, but the name among the Malay people has always been Persekutuan Tanah Melayu, never the word of Malaya. And I was very conscious of the fact that when I came in as a student in Singapore, it was the University of Malaya. Why was the University of Malaya in Singapore? Very simple. Singapore was part of Malaya. It was the capital of Malaya. So there was no such place as Singapore. So what do you mean by Singapore history? You have to reimagine it. There was no Singapore. There was only Malaya. And if you ask me, when all my time that I can remember being conscious of it, I was always a Malayan. I was never a Singaporean. I was never a Malaysian either, because my whole idea of becoming a Malayan was the most important event at the time when it was Persekutuan Tanah Melayu. I was called a Malayan. So this naming, so what I think is the conference should have been reimagining or renaming history, not just reimagining. So naming and reimagining got to be taken together to say that every time you change the name, you're already reimagined. You have to reimagine to justify why you have to change the name. So this takes me back to this Japan thing about Shonan. I think it's very significant that the Japanese changed only one name in the whole of Southeast Asia. And yet nobody has actually written about that, to my knowledge. And even the Japanese record, nobody has actually searched through to say why the Japanese decided that they would not call Singapore, Singapore, but they called Malaya, Marai. I mean, I grew up during the Japanese occupation in Ipoh, in the state of Perak, and the country was always referred to as Marai, but Marai did not include Singapore. So long before the separation, the Japanese had already decided Malaya was the rest of it, including the stray settlements of Malacca and Penang, but not Singapore. Singapore was Shonan-do. And so that very separation and renaming of Singapore is very much part of this question of changing of names is part of the history of Singapore. Why the names are changed at different times is something to me extremely interesting. For example, I thought also very interesting, among the non-Malays, they adopted the word Malaya right from the beginning. When the British called it British Malaya in the early beginning of the 20th century, all the newspapers that I've seen in Chinese, and I understand that this was true in Tamil, and so on, used the word Malaya. Only the Malay newspapers did not use Malaya. They used Melayu in one way or the other. But even the phrase Tanah Melayu that Winstead used, Tanah Melayu was never defined very clearly. What was Tanah Melayu? What places were included and what were not? As Professor Guan mentioned earlier on, his Tanah Melayu was based on Malacca and Johor. That was his particular understanding of Tanah Melayu. Didn't really include Kedah. and never really included the eastern states of Kelantan, Terengganu, and of course Perlis was just too small to worry about. So all that was not mentioned. So he used Tanah Melayu, including it all, but in his own mind, his Tanah Melayu is really Malacca, Johor. So I think that this is quite clear. And yet that is not quite right, because the same time, another Malay textbook was produced by Awang or something, Sejarah Alam Melayu. His idea of Tanah Melayu was all the Malay world. The whole Malay world was Alam Melayu. And so that, again, Melayu itself was never really defined. And the people of Melayu are included, as far as I know, included the people of Sumatra. In fact, Winsett himself says, all these Melayu all came from Sumatra. He actually talks about that. All came from Sumatra. So who are the Melayu even? So even in that time when it was Alam Melayu or Tanah Melayu, the Melayu itself is so widespread. And of course, in Indonesia itself, people use Melayu. In fact, they were debating between, even during the Japanese occupation, they were debating between Indonesia Raya or Melayu Raya. So Indonesia Raya and Melayu Raya were more or less equivalent. And it included the whole Malay world, including the Philippines. It was had nothing to do with Islam. It was a kind of ethnic definition of all those who were of this Austronesian language speakers that and belonging to the maritime world of Nusantara and the seas, all the islands of Java, Sumatra, and all the islands in between. This is all Melayu. So there, in fact, you also find books in the Philippines who talk about Rizal being the hero of the Malay people. Pride of the Malay race was Rizal, who was not a Muslim at all, I mean, a Catholic from the Philippines. So at that point, Melayu was really widespread. And the Japanese actually toyed with the idea of whether it is Indonesia Raya or Indonesia should include Marae. But the Japanese decided, in fact, to keep Marae and use Indonesia separately. So again, who named, why it was named, and what the consequences of the naming also has reflections in reimagining. So reimagining Singapore will have to reimagine what is Melayu. I think I better stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. We have a few minutes for questions, so we're going to open the floor.
A robotic arm, if you program it to turn its arm to the right, it will always turn to the right. It will never turn to the left, up or down. So similarly for human beings, we are powered by our thoughts, feelings, and values. If our thoughts, feelings, or values, anything that's predominant, that is powerful, that prevails all others, ask the arm to turn to the right, the arm will always turn to the right. It will never turn to the left, up, down, or wherever. So I want to ask, what can we do, whether we reimagine the past, the present, or the future, what narrative can we have so that we move in the right direction, where we move the arm to the right and never to the left, up or down. Just like the four great traditions, Jesus, Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, they had contentment as the final vision. They had the, direction and the roadmap to contentment. They also had virtue, also can be said the virtue was the prime value. Right now, the democracies prime the value as liberation of freedom as the prime value, not virtue. But Aristotle and Plato, the nation state or city state, virtue is the prime value for philosopher king, aristocracy, democracy, then tyranny. Right now, democracy always put democracy as the best, nothing better than democracy. They forgot about aristocracy and philosopher king. Of course, nowadays, nobody talks about virtue. Even those talk about virtue, they are faking it, they are pretending it, so that for power. So, I want to ask, what can you imagine so that, like Jesus, reimagine the Old Testament, Moses' laws and history, Israel's history, so that becomes Christianity and bring forward the Western civilization with Renaissance and Enlightenment. What can we do so that Singapore too can have a philosophical age like in Athens, in Greece, a Renaissance and an Enlightenment, all three into one, where we can reverse discontent, reverse mental illness, reverse dementia. If you have contentment, you cannot have discontent. If you have contentment, you cannot have mental illness also. And if you have contentment, you also cannot have dementia, because all are escapism from reality. So what can you do? Reimagine thoughts, feelings, and values, so we are in the right direction of virtue and contentment. Thank you.
Would anyone like to take this one?
Yeah. You are asking a very profound question to a very simple historians. I think, Prof. Wang, I can speak for you, we are historians that look at the past. Historians don't look at the future. You have to look for a prophet to answer your question.
There's one part you talked about in indoctrination, so I'm just going to respond to that really quickly. I think the purpose of this new type of historiography is not to undo indoctrination or indoctrinate you into thinking in a new certain way. I think the point of what we're doing here is to show you that history is, first of all, it's about questions, it's about curiosity. And I think the beauty of this newer historiography is that there's not one definitive way to write Singapore history. There's a lot of many different ways. And so part of the project of this book is to encourage you to think about how to think about history. And that means moving beyond indoctrination, moving beyond a framework where there's one definitive answer. And so I think my one response to that part would be just to move beyond the idea of history as indoctrination and more towards history as a mode of thinking. Any other questions?
Okay, I've got a burning question, because listening to all of you, it's really been wonderful. History is often, is usually written by the victors, okay? So there are different versions of history in the English language, in the Dutch language, and maybe in the Chinese language, in several languages. So are there any conflicts between those versions?
The short answer is yes. It all depends on who is writing that history in what language. So quite clearly, as Prof. Wang will tell you, the Chinese historian, the Song dynasty, looking at the South Seas, will have a very different viewpoint of what he has heard and wants to record in the history annuals for posterity in Chinese. But you ask Effendy, in the 19th century, the Sejarah Melayu, written in Malay, for a very different audience with a very different point of view. So it all depends who is writing the history for whom.
This comes from 1,000 years ago when I did my defense. One of my professors asked me, Effendy, what is history to you? Direct answer, history comes from a historian who tries his or her best to reconstruct the past using the best sources available. We try to keep at that as best as possible and leave the politics to somebody else. So this is our main task as past makers, as history makers, basically. Whatever come what may out of it is really up to you. However, we all here understand the repercussions of rewriting history, the repercussions of reimagining history. For me personally, it is trying to, at least for my topics of Malay rulers of Singapore, is how to reincorporate them into a history that have long excluded them. How to do so is very difficult, all right? So this is my task. all these other amazing historians here have their own tasks and ways of doing it as well. But that's my own.
May I just add one more dimension, which actually definitely affects us today. And this is, I mean, historians have done different things all through the centuries in the past. But what has happened today in the last, I would say, last 100 years or so in Asia is the idea of creating a nation state. Now this takes me back to the conference you organized when I talked about borders. Why we have Southeast Asian history was because those people drew the borders of the place of not China and not India, that was just called Southeast Asia. So in other words, by drawing the borders, they created something that had to find its own history. So Southeast Asian history came out of the fact that there was now a place called Southeast Asia. Similarly with nation states, because at the end of colonialism, we all ended up with different nation states. And in Southeast Asia, we have 10, going to be 11, but we're 10. And then, but these borders were not drawn by us. Almost all the borders were drawn by somebody else. But having inherited borders, then we have to find its own history. So in a way, we take the borders to start with and then trace its history. Because there was no such place that they asked for the history of Singapore until Singapore became a nation state. When Singapore became a nation state, then it looks back and you say, where did it come from? How did we start? And so on. Then you go back. And while all that is actually very, very important and extremely exciting and stimulating and so on, there are also dangers, and you distort history. You could easily distort history if you don't bear in mind that this is just a way of trying to understand ourselves. Because I remember as a young student, this was where it really hit me for the first time, at a time when our generation was very excited at the idea of nation building. We were going to build a nation called Malaya, so that was fine. But what happened was, while I was in my third year or something like that, there was produced a book called History of Belgium. Now, you know the country of Belgium. And the history of Belgium traced back the history of Belgium of everything that happened within the borders of modern Belgium, going back to Roman times, all the Germanic tribes, also all the various monarchies, all the way down to the creation of this Kingdom of Belgium, which was really an accident in a way, due to the breakup of the Spanish Empire, when the Netherlands got separated, and the Catholics and the Protestants couldn't agree, so the Catholics were left with Belgium, and the Protestants became Netherlands. But these are all events in history. But the point about I wanted to make was, I suddenly realized a history of Belgium meant that you went back to history, or you go down in history, all the way down, anything that happened within the border. So a town that was probably part of the same people, the Bulgarian people, and so on, but now part of France, is no longer part of Belgium history. So because the borders have been redrawn. So this is what happened to Singapore. And because I'm very conscious of that, because to me as a Malayan, always included Singapore. Singapore, to me, doesn't have a separate history. It's part of the history of Malaya. But that was, of course, just my generation. But that was not to be. And when Singapore was asked to leave or was kicked out, or whatever you call it, from Malaysia and became independent, then you have to find a history of Singapore. And it's perfectly justified. I'm not saying it's not. But what you do is then start to write a history, which is just about Singapore alone, without Tanah Melayu, without Winstead's Tanah Melayu or Melayu Raya, all of these things, because the borders have changed. Even when you mentioned Benjamin Koo about the Dutch, Anglo-Dutch treaty, that treaty has broken up Melayu Raya, Indonesia Raya. Before that, you don't distinguish between the people on both sides of the Straits of Malacca. They were all Malays, and even Winstead said they were all Malays. In fact, he actually, when he was asked, he actually said that all the people who settled in Malaya, in the Malay states, all came from Sumatra. That's where the Malay comes from, even including Singapore. I mean, the independent of Singapore was a prince from Palembang, from the old Srivijaya came over here. Malacca was created as part of that remnants of a Srivijaya empire, and so on and so forth. You can go on and on, whether it's Aceh or the Malay world or Srivijaya. There's no difference. And yet, by that treaty in 1824, we now have a border which still exists today. It is one of the most extraordinary colonial borders that I've ever heard of. Because by drawing that treaty, today we have Malaysia and Indonesia as two separate countries, and both have fully accepted it now. It's taken for granted. You have a history of Malaysia and a history of Indonesia, and we make very, very clear, this is not our history, that's our history. So I think we have to take into account that borders make a big difference too, and yet each time the borders change, you have to rewrite your history again.
But if I may come back to your question about sources of history, I think the challenge for all historians today is that they have to go beyond one language source. So if you look only at the British sources, the Straits Settlement records, then yes, the century before Raffles, the 18th century, nothing happened, as Matthew has so clearly made. It was a dark century. But if you look at the Dutch sources, there was a lot happening. And if you look at the Malay sources, the Tufaq al-Nafis, they got a very different account of what was happening about the Raja Negara. So the challenge for history today is to go beyond your reliance on only one language source, be it Chinese or Malay or whatever, and how do you combine these different languages to get a more nuanced picture? And the point here is that when you read these sources, you have to understand, question, interrogate is now the word, who wrote those records for whom? So if you read the Straits Settlement records, which Prof. Wang, myself, when we were history students, we thought, that's accurate, that's reliable, is the records of what happened in Singapore from 1819 to 1867, the Straits Settlement records. And we took that as biblical truth. But if you question it, why is this report in the Straits Settlement record? Who thought of it as a useful event to write a report upon? So here, when they report on Sultan Ali, what was their intent? How were they seeing Sultan Ali? So you got to recognize that you are looking at Sultan Ali through the eyes of the British officials. And that's where, like a good literary scholar, so why is the British telling me this about Sultan Ali? What are they not telling me about Sultan Ali that they should? So it's not simply just reading the sources literally, biblical, that is true, but the underlying intent against the grain and with the grain to get a better understanding of why are the British telling us this, and then, as Effendy has said, you get a more in-depth picture of who and why is Sultan Ali so left out of our history.
All right, thank you very much. I think that's going to be our last question because we ran a bit over time. But our book is set to release August 5th. There's pre-order links up if you're interested. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.